So now we have two amazing keynote speakers. I'm really excited to hear from each of them. First, we have Senator Michael Gianaris, who's the Deputy Majority Leader of the New York State Senate, representing Western Queens. He was born and raised in Astoria and still lives there. And I'll take some of the language from his bio on his website. I think will really resonate with a lot of us in this room. And it says that he is guided by the principle that the playing field between everyday New Yorkers and powerful interests is grossly skewed in favor of the wealthy. And so with that sort of animating vision, he's been a champion for tenants' rights, for voting reforms, and for workers' rights, and many other issues. Some of his accomplishments: he wrote legislation barring discrimination based on immigration status, secured funding for community groups providing legal services to immigrants in need. In 2019, he passed the most comprehensive tenant protections in New York State history, as well as that same year, the most comprehensive bail reform legislation in the country. And he also wrote legislation to help register more New Yorkers to vote. In relation to the subject that we're talking about today, he is really a leader within the state and nationally. He's the chief sponsor of the 21st Century Antitrust Act, which I was gonna say if it's passed, but I'd rather say when it's passed, will be the most important change to antitrust law at any level of government in a generation. So Senator Gianaris, thank you so much for joining us, and we're really eager to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Yeah. Okay, is that good? Technology. Stand back. Okay. Anyway, enjoy my chin, those of you who are watching. I appreciate the introduction. One caveat is the most comprehensive tenant protections New York State had were passed in 2019, and then we just passed even more comprehensive tenant protections about 3 weeks ago. So we now have something called good cause eviction protections in New York, which has never been the case before. So that's not why we're here, though. We're here to talk about market power and the effect on workers and building workers' power. I want to start by talking about capitalism. Capitalism is, you got to hand it to it, it's ruthlessly and unapologetically efficient at its goal. And its goal is to make money for the people that already have money. And they're very good at it. And part of the problem, I think, in today's society is that we've drifted away from government's role as it relates to capitalism. Okay, capitalism, yes, we support capitalism, it does some good things, it creates jobs, it's innovative, all of the good aspects of what it does do not outweigh the negative aspects of it. And what we're supposed to do with that in a capitalistic society is regulate it, and that's government's job. And unfortunately, we have drifted far away from doing that because of the philosophical direction this country's taken over the last several decades. The previous speaker mentioned it was the post-World War II era. You had a lot of worker strength in this country. The middle class was stronger than it's ever been. And then I think the damage done to working people in this country from the politics of the 1980s are not fully appreciated and are still something we need to unravel. I was on Squawk Box a little while back, and we were talking about tax policy. And of course, their position was, the hosts, that you can't raise taxes on anybody because that's bad. And I said something that I think made Joe Kernan's head explode on the screen. I said, Ronald Reagan was wrong. You guys got to figure that out at some point and help us build a better society for all Americans, or else we're heading in a very dangerous place. And so that's, I think, where we've lost our way is you look at something like antitrust policy, which is what we're here to talk about. It's been a century since the laws really were created and have been looked at. And what has happened in the last 40 years is it has been chopped up. It has been whittled away. Courts have made it harder to bring enforcement actions. The economy itself has morphed into something that those laws were not really applicable to. And what we have tried to do here in New York now is come up with a proposal to change that, which I'll get to in a moment. But want to talk about the dangers of antitrust policy. Here at an academic institution, it's a very intellectual concept, I suppose, but it has real-world implications for people. And historically, antitrust policy was built around, and I think this was also mentioned by the previous speaker, was built around making sure prices are not overly inflated, and not even to make sure that the market is competitive for smaller and middle-sized businesses. It was simply just make sure that there's no impact on the consumer that is detrimental. And that's missing a whole big aspect of the problems with the consolidation market power that we're now seeing. The examples are plentiful. I'll talk about my favorite company, Amazon. For those of you that don't know, I was the person who had about whom the most entries were listed in Amazon's HQ2 burn book because I was given a phone. HQ2 was supposed to be in my district, but we stopped it, so as you all know. As it turns out now, Virginia's not getting it either because they stopped building, they're paring back, they've fired people in the last year, never mind not creating jobs. So I think history has proven us right on that one. But the fact is, here's a company that has obtained unimaginable power over not just the marketplace, but the world, over government, as we saw in that example and others, right? They sat here and told the entire country, you come to us and tell us how much you're giving us for us to even think about placing an office in your city. It was outrageous. It was outrageous. And of course, things being what they are, everyone bent over backwards to accommodate them. And those that won are now suffering the consequences of that. But it doesn't stop there. They have power over our politics. Seattle City Council years ago dared to suggest that they fund a program to help people who are unhoused in Seattle. And Amazon was so offended by that, I guess they spent billions of dollars trying to beat city council people in Seattle in elections. And it's just unfathomable. And so when you talk about the power that they have, yes, they certainly have power over their competitors, over their workers, in a way that we'll talk about, but over every aspect of our lives, in a way that if we believe in some of the foundational principles of our democracy, separation of powers, balance of power amongst different entities, we just lost our way at the altar of the big, powerful corporation. It's happened before, and government reacted the way it was supposed to. We had antitrust laws that took on the robber barons of a century ago, but I guess we are. I was going to say no one is really focusing on it now, but we are. And this is a growing movement that is starting to pay attention to not just the consequences for prices, although that's real also, but the consequences for small businesses, the consequences for workers throughout this country. Because if you're consolidating power over the market, you're also consolidating power over the workforce. New York is a big place with a diverse economy, but you go some other places in the country, and Amazon's it. You want a job? You got to go apply to the local warehouse and hope that they give you a job. And when that happens, they're dictating salaries, they're dictating benefits, they're dictating hours, and you don't, as a potential employee, you don't have the opportunity to say, well, I'm going to go somewhere else and work over here because they're offering me a better deal. The more concentrated the power is, the more concentrated the market is, the less opportunity there is for a worker to leverage their position and bargain effectively. And so that is why what we're talking about today is so critically important, and why it's necessary to take our antitrust laws and pivot them to something that is more impactful in the 21st century, which is why we call my legislation the 21st Century Antitrust Act, because we're trying to do that. The laws haven't been updated, the penalties in New York anyway. New York has always had its own parallel antitrust laws, very similar to the federal laws, but we have had the opportunity to bring enforcement actions as a state in addition to waiting for our friends in the federal government to do so. And so that has been the history of New York's approach to this, and New York being so economically powerful and important, what we do impacts the rest of the country and indeed the world. And so we're trying now to say, we're trying to revolutionize the way we think about antitrust enforcement. And we've taken aspects of other jurisdictions that do this, we think much more effectively. Particularly in Europe, they have a standard that is very different from the way the U.S. Enforces antitrust. They have something called abuse of dominance as the marker for determining when the law has been violated. So we are proposing adopting that here in New York. The penalties in our New York antitrust laws haven't been updated in half a century, so we're at the point where enforcement of the Donnelly Act, which is what we call it, is ineffective, because when you're talking about $1 million penalty, these companies write that off in a couple of minutes without thinking twice about it. So we would actually increase that 100-fold and make the penalties $100 million for violating the act. We would have a pre-merger process that would require the involvement of organized labor when the Attorney General is evaluating whether to approve a proposed merger or not. They would now, they do consider it. I think our Attorney General is doing a great job. In fact, she has been helpful in our drafting the legislation, but they now will consult or think about the effect on labor. We would require labor to be at the table as that analysis is ongoing, and would really enhance the power of organized labor in the conversation about whether a proposed merger should in fact happen. And I think perhaps most importantly, we would adopt a standard for monopsony, which is, I'm sure, something many of you are familiar with, which is power not just over the marketplace and the products that get sold, but power over the workforce. So we say power as a seller is the power over the marketplace. Power as a buyer, a purchaser of employment, so to speak, is the part we would add, which would, for the first time, allow an evaluation of the consequences on a workforce of over concentration of power. So the example I gave earlier, if you have a situation where you have one or two employers in a particular market and they are asserting themselves to the detriment of their workforce, that is something that regulators can use in an enforcement action. So predictably, the usual suspects are suggesting that we are destroying the country, tearing it apart at the seams, doing things that would lead to people fleeing New York. That's my favorite excuse for everything we propose. Everyone's going to leave New York. What's interesting is the last year or so, we finally have some data showing the truth, which is, I mean, New York has lost relative population. You see that because our members of Congress have decreased, right? That's true enough. But what's really happening is it's not the millionaires and billionaires who are leaving. I'm sure some of them are. They end up getting replaced. In fact, we have more millionaires today than we had before COVID. But what's happening is working people are leaving because they can't afford to live here. And they're not getting the kind of help that they need to survive and live a good life here in New York. So we need to refocus that conversation as well. But we're facing a mountain of opposition. Events like this are so important to help us communicate what it is we're trying to do and why. Because it's a very, as I mentioned at the outset, a very academic issue in some ways. And so my colleagues who are busy trying to get housing for their constituents and do some of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis and making the lives of the people they represent better are not often sitting here thinking about, I thought that was Amazon trying to bust in. Stop speaking. But we have some work to do to educate people about the importance of this approach. And you mentioned you want to see it pass. The Senate has passed this proposal a couple times going now. We're trying to get to the Assembly to join us this year. We have some good prospects in terms of sponsorship, and you should be hearing about that shortly. But we're excited about where this goes. We don't have a ton of time this year. We have about a month left in our session, so I'm hoping we'll be able to get progress in the other house. But we're not going to let it go. And we need your help to keep the conversation going and make it clear that this is something that is important, yes, for workers, but for the entire country, because without a vibrant middle class, this country gets very divided, very unequal, very quickly. And I think, I fear that we already reached a breaking point as it relates to that, because it's been getting worse and worse for about a half a century now. So it's our job to turn that around. And I know we can do it if we all roll up our sleeves and work hard enough. So thank you for giving me a few moments, and enjoy the rest of the day.